Tom Hanks stops traffic to help woman struck by driver. Crowd amazed. The morning sun blazed through the crowded streets, splintering light across windshields and glinting off chrome. It was a Monday like any other. A crush of impatient drivers honking their horns, frustrated pedestrians weaving through traffic like a maze, and the low rumble of engines echoing down the boulevard. In the middle of this chaos, no one noticed the woman at first. Her name was Linda Bowers, a woman in her mid-50s who looked older than her years from a life that hadn't been kind. Clad in jeans and a faded sweater, she clutched her shopping bag tightly as she stepped off the curb. She wasn't in a rush, her movements slow and deliberate, eyes scanning the intersection. She'd done this 100 times before. Cross at the light, watch for impatient cars, make it to the other side. But not today. The silver sedan came out of nowhere, its engine roaring just as the traffic light turned yellow. The driver, careless and distracted, wasn't even looking. Linda froze. It happened fast but stretched endlessly, as moments of terror often do. 1 foot barely off the curb, the sickening screech of tires filled the air, and before anyone could shout, the sedan clipped her. The impact sent Linda sprawling sideways, her bag scattering oranges and apples across the asphalt. She crumpled like paper, stunned and silent. Her body sprawled halfway into the crosswalk. The world went quiet for half a second before it exploded into sound. Brakes shrieking, horns blasting, and horrified murmurs spreading through the gathering crowd. No one knew what to do. Cars inched forward, some weaving around Linda as if she were little more than debris blocking the way. The driver of the silver sedan, a balding man in a crisp white shirt, sat frozen, hands gripping the wheel, eyes wide with panic. He didn't step out to help. No one did. The flow of traffic demanded movement, and no one wanted to be the one to hold it up. Faces in car windows turned away, unwilling to meet the eyes of a woman lying helpless in the road. That's when the man appeared. From the sidewalk came the unmistakable stride of someone who wasn't in a rush but carried purpose in every step. A blue shirt, crisply pressed, moved through the crowd. Broad shoulders, a familiar face, Tom Hanks. First, no one recognized him. Maybe it was the shock of seeing a celebrity where no one expected. Maybe it was disbelief that someone like him would wade into a chaotic street. But Tom didn't hesitate. He moved straight into the intersection, arms outstretched, palms flat, his voice loud and commanding. "Stop! Hold up!" The traffic obeyed. It wasn't the voice of an actor playing a hero. It was the real thing. Engines grumbled into silence. Pedestrians paused mid-step. A chorus of muttering rose from car windows, but no one dared inch forward. The sheer authority in his presence froze the world. Tom didn't stop there. He crouched beside Linda, speaking softly as her dazed eyes flickered open. She recognized him. How could she not? But the pain clouded her face. "Hey there, miss," he said, his voice warm and steady. "You're gonna be okay, all right? Help's on the way." Linda's lips trembled, but no sound came. Her fingers weakly grasped at the air. Tom reached down and gently took her hand, squeezing it just enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Around them, whispers buzzed through the crowd. "Is that? No way. That's Tom Hanks. What's he doing here?" But Tom ignored it all. A woman in the crowd had already pulled out her phone to dial emergency services. But Tom glanced around anyway, looking for someone more official. "You," he pointed at a man holding a camera. "Run to the nearest station. Get help here now." The man blinked as if startled, then bolted down the sidewalk without a word. A few other bystanders edged forward, unsure if they should step in. Tom noticed their hesitation and nodded encouragingly. "She's stable, but we can't move her," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Help me keep this area clear." Within seconds, what had been chaos turned into quiet order. A middle-aged woman in a yellow dress began gathering Linda's scattered fruit, setting them neatly in her bag as if somehow restoring a small piece of dignity to the broken moment. A young man in a baseball cap waved down cars that were still inching forward, his arms moving with the same authority Tom had shown minutes earlier. Linda groaned softly, her voice barely audible. Tom leaned closer. "You're safe now," he assured her. "You're not alone." Sweat beaded on his brow from the heat radiating off the asphalt, but he didn't move. He stayed right there, holding her hand, as if his mere presence could tether her to safety. The world seemed to shrink around them, the noise of traffic replaced by hushed murmurs and the distant wail of sirens. The driver of the silver sedan still hadn't moved. He sat slumped in his seat, his face pale and hands shaking. Tom shot him a glance, sharp, unmistakable, before turning his attention back to Linda. The sirens grew louder now, cutting through the stifling silence. Paramedics were on their way, but Tom didn't move from Linda's side. He kept speaking to her, soft words no one else could hear, his tone gentle and familiar. To anyone watching, it felt surreal. The man they'd seen 1,000 times on screen, playing heroes, captains, and ordinary men rising to extraordinary moments, was here in real life doing it for real. And as the crowd thickened, cameras began to emerge. Phones held high, people began recording, their shock evident in the angles of their trembling hands. "Tom Hanks just stopped traffic," someone whispered in awe. "I can't believe it," another voice chimed in. "Is he really helping her?" He was. Tom didn't notice the cameras, or if he did, he didn't care. This wasn't a performance. There was no script, no cameras rolling for some feel-good blockbuster. There was only a woman who needed help, and a man who refused to look the other way. The ambulance finally pulled into view, red and blue lights flashing across the stunned faces of the crowd. The paramedics jumped out with practiced urgency, threading through the onlookers to reach Linda. Tom stepped back, carefully relinquishing her hand to the professionals, but he didn't leave. He stayed just out of their way, watching intently, as if to make sure she truly was in safe hands. Linda's head turned slightly toward him as they lifted her onto the stretcher. A flicker of something, a thank you perhaps, passed through her eyes. Tom nodded once, the smallest of smiles tugging at his lips. Then, as the medics loaded her into the ambulance and the crowd began to disperse, Tom Hanks did something extraordinary. He didn't linger, he didn't look for applause, and he didn't stay to answer the barrage of questions being shouted his way. Instead, he turned and disappeared back into the sidewalk, melting into the crowd like any ordinary man. But ordinary he was not. The ambulance's wail faded into the distance, leaving behind a stunned quiet as the crowd slowly began to scatter. It was as though time itself had paused to watch what had just unfolded. Cars still sat motionless at odd angles, the ripple effect of Tom Hanks's intervention holding the traffic at bay like an invisible force. For the people who had witnessed it, this was something they would remember for a lifetime. A man in a brown suit shook his head as he watched the spot where Tom Hanks had stood just moments earlier. "Unbelievable," he muttered, almost to himself. The guy just walked right into the street, like he owned it. The middle-aged woman in the yellow dress, who'd been collecting Linda's scattered fruit, straightened up with a huff. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the apples back into the torn bag. "He didn't care about anything else but helping her," she said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. "Not the cars, not the people staring. He just did it." The murmurs grew louder, stories spreading and changing as they passed from one onlooker to the next. Some swore Tom had stopped the car with his bare hands. Others claimed they saw him carry Linda off the ground before the ambulance arrived. Whispers took flight like wildfire, fueled by the video clips now zipping through social media. Somewhere near the front of the intersection, a teenage boy with shaggy dark hair stared down at his phone screen, thumbs moving quickly. "Dude, I'm telling you, it's viral already. Look," he shouted to his friend, shoving his phone into the boy's face. The video he'd captured, Tom Hanks stepping into the street, arms outstretched like a modern-day Moses parting the Red Sea, was already racking up likes and shares. The caption read, "Tom Hanks stops traffic. Real-life hero. #Hanks for the save." A group of onlookers, young and old, huddled around their own devices, watching and re-watching the footage like it was a scene from a blockbuster movie. The angle caught Tom mid-stride, face determined, arms out as traffic froze under the weight of his presence. Someone had added dramatic music, the swelling chords of a film score, making it look even more cinematic. But it wasn't a movie. Meanwhile, the silver sedan's driver had finally stirred. He stepped out of his car with shaking hands, eyes darting around like he expected someone to pounce on him at any moment. A few lingering onlookers gave him harsh, accusing glares, and one man in a baseball cap muttered under his breath as he passed by. "Some nerve you've got, driving like that," the man said, not bothering to hide the anger in his voice. The driver didn't respond. He looked lost, unsure of what to do next. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was shame, but his hesitation only seemed to deepen the crowd's disapproval. The teenage boy who'd been filming turned his camera on him now, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Hey man, you know you're all over the internet, right? You're the guy who hit someone and got schooled by Tom Hanks," the boy said, loud enough for others to hear. The driver's face went pale, sweat beading at his temple as whispers picked up again. "Leave him be," a voice rang out firmly. The crowd turned in unison, and there he was again, Tom Hanks. He'd reappeared as quietly as he'd left, like a ghost of the moment, but this time his face was harder, his jaw set, his gaze unflinching. For a man who spent his life bringing kind-hearted characters to the big screen, there was nothing soft about him now. "Accidents happen," Tom said, his voice even and clear. "What matters is what we do after." The teenage boy shrank back slightly, lowering his phone. The driver looked at Tom with a mix of relief and guilt, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had just settled back onto him. Tom walked past him without another word and addressed the crowd instead. "It's done, folks," he said simply. "The paramedics are taking care of her. Let's let them do their job." There was no need to shout or demand. Somehow, his voice alone carried enough weight to dissolve the tension. Slowly, people began to turn away, conversations trailing off into softer tones. A few murmured about heading back to work or running late for errands. One by one, cars started to edge back into motion, the flow of traffic resuming like a river that had been temporarily dammed. But Tom didn't leave. He crossed back to the sidewalk, scanning the faces of the people who still lingered, those who weren't ready to move on just yet. His eyes landed on the woman in yellow, still holding Linda's battered bag of groceries. She was clutching it to her chest like it was made of glass, as though handing it over to anyone else would shatter what little remained of the moment. Tom approached her, his expression softening again. "May I?" he asked gently, gesturing to the bag. The woman blinked up at him, clearly flustered. I just didn't want her things to get lost," she stammered. Tom smiled, a small, genuine smile that seemed to ease the tension in her shoulders. "You did good," he said softly. "Thank you." She handed him the bag, her hands shaking just a little. Tom nodded to her once more before tucking the bag carefully under his arm, like it was the most important thing in the world. Then he turned to leave again, weaving through the crowd without ceremony, without any grand farewell. And yet, his presence lingered long after he was gone. The teenage boy stared after him, phone still in hand. He whispered to his friend, "Man, he really is exactly how people say he is." The other boy shrugged. "What, like nice?" "Yeah," the first boy replied. "But more than that, like real." And for the people who had been there, those who had seen the chaos, the fear, and the quiet way Tom Hanks had stepped in to bring order, it wasn't just about the videos, the tweets, or the headlines that would come. It was about the way one person's courage, no matter how simple, had changed everything. Somewhere down the street, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, and the city returned to its usual rhythms. But for those who had stood in that intersection, who had watched a man step up when no one else would, they knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the city, but the memory of what had just unfolded felt sharper than the heat pressing down on the pavement. Strangers walked away with their heads turned slightly over their shoulders, eyes lingering on the spot where Tom Hanks had stopped traffic as though leaving too quickly might break the spell. Among those who stayed was a young woman clutching her toddler's hand. Her gaze darted from where the ambulance had been to the direction Tom Hanks had disappeared. "I can't believe it was him," she whispered to no one in particular. Beside her, the boy, maybe 3 or 4, tugged at her hand with curiosity. "Who's the man, Mommy?" he asked, his voice piping up over the low hum of traffic returning to life. The woman smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as if choosing her words carefully. "That's someone who cares, baby," she said softly. "Someone brave enough to help." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer, but the woman's words clung to the air, unwelcome echoes among those who'd stayed back too long. Near the curb, the silver sedan still sat idling where its driver had abandoned it for the sidewalk, unsure if leaving was worse than staying. It was clear he didn't want to be seen. His head hung low, his arms folded tightly as if holding himself together. Someone had stepped close enough to hear him mutter apologies under his breath, though whether to himself or to the crowd, no one could tell. Further down the block, unnoticed by most, Tom Hanks walked at a calm, deliberate pace. He carried Linda's battered grocery bag under his arm, as though he'd been entrusted with something fragile and precious. His blue shirt, crisp and clean earlier, now had dark stains where sweat pooled beneath the afternoon sun, and faint smudges of dirt lined the edges of his sleeves. And yet he moved as though none of it mattered. For Tom, the scene he'd left behind wasn't finished. It wasn't enough to stop traffic. It wasn't enough to comfort Linda on the ground or quiet the crowd that had turned something human into something surreal. There was still something unsettled, a need to see it through. He turned into a small corner shop just past the intersection, where a rusted bell above the door let out a tired chime. Inside, the air was cool and still, an oasis against the thick smog of the streets. Behind the counter, a wiry man in his late 60s adjusted his glasses with a frown, squinting as Tom entered. "Afternoon," the man said cautiously. "You're in a bit of a state, friend." Tom offered a small, apologetic smile. "It's been a long one," he admitted, holding up Linda's torn bag. "I've got some groceries to replace." The shopkeeper squinted harder, leaning forward as if trying to decipher a puzzle before him. His eyes widened just slightly, and Tom could see the moment recognition dawned. The older man sucked in a breath, pressing a hand to his chest. "Well, I'll be. You're just someone buying some apples," Tom interrupted, his tone light, his smile kind but pointed. The man blinked, caught off guard but smiling back after a moment. He gestured to the narrow aisles of his shop with a sweeping hand. "Help yourself, Mr. Help yourself." Tom didn't linger to hear the shopkeeper stumble over titles or names. He moved toward the small produce section tucked into the back corner, where fresh fruit gleamed beneath buzzing overhead lights. The apples sat piled in neat rows, their waxy red skin polished to a shine. Tom took his time selecting them, inspecting each piece carefully before adding it to the bag as though choosing jewels rather than fruit. As he moved through the aisles, a quiet figure emerged from the entrance. The teenage boy from earlier, the one who'd filmed the entire scene on his phone, crept into the shop with the kind of cautious energy only a kid out of his depth could manage. His shoes scuffed against the tile floor as he shuffled closer to the produce section, eyes darting nervously toward Tom. Sir?" the boy said hesitantly. Tom turned slightly, one eyebrow raised in that trademark expression millions had seen on screen. The boy swallowed hard and cleared his throat. "Sorry, He held up his phone. "I got it all on camera. Back there. You helping that woman." Tom's gaze flicked to the phone for only a moment before he turned back to the apples, placing another carefully into the bag. "Did you?" he said softly, his tone not harsh but far from encouraging. The boy nodded quickly. "Yeah, people are already watching it, like a lot of people. It's crazy. Everyone's saying you're a hero and..." He trailed off, his excitement faltering as Tom looked at him again, this time meeting his eyes directly. "A hero, huh?" Tom said quietly. "For what? Doing what anyone should have done." The boy shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing back toward the shop entrance as though considering an escape. "Well, no one else did," he muttered. Tom held his gaze a beat longer before his expression softened. He let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire morning, then tucked the bag of fruit under his arm and straightened up. "Kid, you want to film something worth sharing?" Tom said, his voice measured but kind. Put the camera down next time and be the person who steps up. No one needs to be famous for doing the right thing. The boy stared at him, mouth slightly open. Words caught somewhere between his brain and his tongue. Finally, he looked down at his phone, turning it over in his palm like he didn't recognize it anymore. Tom offered him a small nod, a quiet sign of encouragement, before heading toward the counter. The shopkeeper rang him up quickly, eyes still wide as he fumbled for change. Tom waved it off, pressing a few bills into the man's hands before stepping back out into the heat of the afternoon. The teenage boy stayed behind, rooted to the spot, staring after him like he was seeing something or someone for the very first time. Tom emerged back onto the sidewalk, bag of apples and oranges tucked securely in his grip. The street had calmed now, traffic moving in its usual rhythm, but the weight of what had happened earlier still lingered. There were no crowds now, no cameras, no sirens, no noise, just a city returning to itself. Tom set off back toward the direction where Linda's ambulance had headed. His stride slow but purposeful. He didn't walk like a man looking for a headline or validation. He walked like a man who wasn't finished doing what he came to do. The rhythm of the city returned in scattered bursts. A bus groaned to a stop at the far corner. Horns blared in sporadic frustration, and the quiet shuffle of pedestrians filled the spaces between sounds. Tom Hanks moved through it all like he belonged there, like the chaos and noise didn't reach him. The battered grocery bag sat cradled in his arm, its weight seemingly small but significant in his grip. He walked with the steady pace of someone carrying more than fruit, someone carrying purpose. Ahead, the low brick building of Westside Medical Center emerged from behind the crowd of cars, its white facade chipped and weathered but welcoming. The emergency entrance loomed just around the corner, its bay doors swinging open and shut as paramedics brought in gurneys and hospital staff darted in and out. It wasn't a quiet place, but there was an order to it, a rhythm Tom immediately respected. Inside the glass doors, he spotted her. Linda. She lay on a gurney just beyond the entrance, a nurse at her side checking vitals and jotting notes on a clipboard. Linda's sweater was gone, replaced by a loose hospital gown that seemed to swallow her frame. Her face, pale and lined with quiet pain, was turned toward the ceiling, her lips moving as though trying to form a prayer she'd forgotten the words to. Her eyes fluttered open every few seconds but seemed distant, detached from everything happening around her. Tom stepped closer, hesitating at the edge of the glass where the automatic doors hadn't yet registered his presence. For the first time, something flickered in his face. A moment of pause, maybe even doubt. He stood there in his stained shirt, clutching a bag of fruit like it was a bouquet of flowers, and he wondered whether she'd even recognize him. Or worse, whether this would feel like charity. Then he saw it. The nurse leaned close to say something, a reassurance, no doubt, but Linda turned her face slightly away, her hand fluttering up weakly in a gesture of dismissal. Tom recognized the movement for what it was. She wasn't pushing away the care. She was pushing away her own fear. She didn't want to be a burden. Tom's hesitation vanished. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh as he stepped through, his figure immediately drawing the attention of the nurse. Her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, her pen hovering above her clipboard, but Tom smiled faintly and gave her a small nod. It was a silent signal. "I'm here to help, not to get in the way." The nurse seemed to understand. She stepped back, giving him space without question. Tom approached Linda's gurney quietly, stopping just short of the edge so as not to startle her. Linda, her eyelids fluttered again, and this time, she turned her head. Her gaze took a moment to focus, but when it did, her breath caught audibly in her throat. "Oh," she whispered, her voice faint and raspy. "It's you." "Hi," Tom said softly, offering a small smile. I thought you might want these back." He held up the bag, its handle crumpled and sagging under the weight of the fresh apples and oranges. Linda's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, the lines of worry on her face smoothed into something softer. She blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening with tears that hadn't quite fallen yet. "You brought them," she breathed. "Well, I couldn't let perfectly good fruit go to waste," Tom teased gently, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. I owe you at least that much for all the trouble I caused out there in the street." Linda let out a small, broken sound that might have been a laugh, though it cracked halfway through. You didn't cause trouble," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved me." Tom shook his head lightly, setting the bag down on the small tray beside her gurney. "I did what anyone should have done. It just happened to be me." "No," Linda said quickly, her fingers twitching against the thin hospital blanket. Her voice grew a little stronger now, though it still wavered. "You stopped. No one else did. They just kept going. Like I wasn't even there." The words hit Tom like a quiet blow to the chest. He swallowed once, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Well," he said after a beat, his voice low, "you're here now, and that matters. You matter." Linda's lip trembled, and this time the tears broke free, slipping down her cheeks in thin, silent tracks. She turned her face slightly away, as though embarrassed, but Tom didn't look away. He didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't pretend not to notice. He just stood there with the quiet patience of someone who understood that sometimes people needed space to feel seen. The nurse, watching from a few feet away, stepped forward after a moment, placing a gentle hand on Linda's shoulder. "You're going to be okay, ma'am," she said softly. "The doctor will be in soon to go over your scans, and we'll make sure you get some rest." Linda nodded weakly, her gaze lingering on Tom for just a second longer. Then, with visible effort, she whispered, "Thank you for everything." Tom smiled, a small, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Linda. Just focus on getting better, okay?" She nodded again, and with that, the nurse guided the gurney slowly toward the hall, leaving Tom standing there alone in the center of the emergency room. Around him, doctors moved with practiced precision, the distant beeping of machines echoing faintly through the open space. It was a busy place, a chaotic place, but none of it seemed to touch him. As Tom turned to leave, the door slid open once more, and a woman stepped into the lobby, her eyes darting anxiously around. She was younger than Linda, maybe in her late 30s, with the same pale blue eyes and sharp features that hinted at a familial resemblance. A caregiver, perhaps, or a daughter. "Excuse me," she said hurriedly, grabbing the sleeve of a passing nurse. "I'm looking for Linda Bowers. She was brought in." "She's okay," Tom said softly, his voice cutting through the hum of the room. The woman turned, startled, her gaze locking onto him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened as recognition set in. "Wait, are you?" Tom shook his head lightly, lifting a hand to stop the question before it could be asked. "She's resting," he said simply. "She'll be okay." The woman blinked, visibly shaken, then nodded quickly. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice unsteady. Thank you." Tom offered her a small smile before turning and walking back toward the entrance. This time, as the glass doors whooshed open, the weight in his chest felt lighter. He didn't look back, didn't wait to see if anyone noticed him leave. It didn't matter. Outside the hospital, the sun had begun its slow descent, spilling a softer, golden light across the streets. The chaotic buzz of earlier had dulled to a hum as the day shifted toward evening. People moved with tired purpose now, conversations hushed, footsteps less hurried. It was the kind of atmosphere that allowed moments of reflection to slip in unnoticed. Tom Hanks paused near the hospital entrance, exhaling slowly as if shedding the weight of the day with that single breath. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and warm asphalt, but it was cleaner here, less suffocating than the crowded intersection he had left behind hours ago. A breeze stirred, rustling the leaves on the few sapling trees lining the sidewalk, their thin branches swaying gently. He adjusted the strap of his watch, a nervous habit he didn't even realize he had until it was done, then looked up and down the street. It was quieter here. No cameras, no gawking crowds, no whispers of his name. Just quiet, but not for long. From the corner of his eye, he caught a familiar silhouette lingering just beyond the edge of the hospital parking lot. It was the teenage boy from earlier, the one who'd filmed everything at the scene. He was perched awkwardly on the curb, one sneaker kicking lazily at a crack in the pavement while his phone sat in his lap, screen dark. His posture was slouched, but there was a tension in his shoulders, like someone waiting for courage to arrive. Tom watched him for a beat, then started walking toward him. The kid didn't notice until Tom's shadow stretched across the sidewalk, and when he looked up, his face flushed crimson. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, shoving his phone into his pocket like it was contraband. "I'm not filming you," he blurted out, hands raised in a sort of surrender. "I swear." Tom smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his pockets as he stopped a few steps away. "I figured," he replied evenly. "If you were, you'd probably be holding the phone a little higher." The kid blinked, visibly thrown off, and then let out a breathless, awkward laugh. "Right," he muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "Guess I'm not great at being subtle." "You're better than you think," Tom said lightly, but his gaze softened as he studied the boy. There was something there. Something behind the bravado, the phone, the eagerness to share what he'd seen. It wasn't malice. It wasn't exploitation. It was confusion, maybe even guilt. "You've been sitting here a while," Tom said, his tone casual but probing. "Waiting for someone?" The kid shrugged one shoulder, his sneakers scuffing the pavement again. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I guess I was waiting for you." Tom tilted his head slightly, a small crease forming in his brow. "Me? Yeah," the boy said, his words tumbling out like a confession. I just don't get it. You're like Tom Hanks. You could have just walked away. Anyone else would have. But you didn't." Tom studied him for a long moment before answering. "What makes you think I wouldn't stop? Because of who I am." The kid hesitated, shoving his hands deeper into his hoodie pockets. "I mean, yeah, kinda. People like you don't just get involved. Not like that." Tom let that settle in the air for a moment, the weight of it heavier than the boy likely realized. "People like me," he echoed softly, shaking his head. "You mean actors? Celebrities? Or just people you think wouldn't bother because someone else will?" The kid didn't respond, but the guilt in his face deepened, his eyes darting down toward his shoes. "You want to know the truth?" Tom continued gently, his voice measured but clear. "I didn't stop because I'm Tom Hanks. I stopped because it was the right thing to do. You don't need to be famous or strong or even brave to help someone. You just need to stop." He paused, letting the words hang between them. "That's all. Just stop." The boy swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing hard. "But what if you can't help? Like, what if you mess up or make it worse?" Tom's smile returned, but there was something sadder about it now, as though the question tugged at an invisible thread within him. "What's worse, making a mistake or standing there doing nothing when someone needs you?" The boy looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. He didn't have an answer, or maybe he did but wasn't ready to say it yet. Tom let him sit with that thought, giving the boy the silence he needed to process. After a beat, Tom gestured to the bench just behind them. "Mind if I sit?" The boy blinked, startled by the question. No. Sure. Go ahead." Tom lowered himself onto the bench with a soft groan, his knees creaking in protest. "Man, I'm getting too old for this much excitement in one day," he muttered playfully. The kid cracked a small smile, sitting back down on the curb, this time facing Tom instead of retreating into himself. For a moment, they sat there together, two strangers brought together by a random, chaotic moment that had spiraled into something neither of them fully understood. The evening air had cooled, and the noise of the city had faded into background static. In that stillness, it felt less like the world was rushing by and more like it had paused, just for a moment. "You know," Tom said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "it's funny. People will watch a movie or a story, and they'll cheer for the character who steps up, right? The one who does the right thing. But when it happens in real life, we freeze. We hesitate." "Yeah," the boy mumbled, staring at his sneakers again. "I don't know why." Tom shrugged lightly. "Maybe because real life doesn't come with a script." The boy glanced up at him then, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "So what do you do when there's no script?" Tom smiled. You make the choice that you'll be proud of later." The boy fell quiet again, his brow furrowed as though trying to fit the pieces together. Tom watched him for a moment, then gave him a small pat on the shoulder before rising from the bench with that same quiet energy he carried everywhere. "Take care, kid," he said, turning to leave. The boy called out after him before he could go. "Hey, thanks." Tom turned back with a grin, tipping an imaginary hat. "Don't thank me, just remember it." And with that, he melted back into the rhythm of the city, leaving the boy sitting alone on the curb, his phone still untouched in his pocket. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to reach for it. Not everything needed to be filmed. Some moments were meant to be remembered. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the warmth of the day began to fade, replaced by the first cool hints of evening. Streetlights flickered on one by one, their faint hum joining the background noise of the city. Tom Hanks walked with an unhurried calm through the neighborhood, blending into the shifting pace of pedestrians coming home from work or drifting toward their next destination. He didn't rush. Tom rarely rushed, but his focus remained steady, his mind replaying the events of the day. Up ahead, voices rose above the usual hum. A small crowd had gathered near a row of parked cars, the edges of their groups spilling onto the sidewalk. Their presence was loud and disruptive, out of sync with the stillness settling over the area. As Tom approached, he could see the source of the commotion. 3 men arguing with a fourth, their voices sharp and hostile. The man at the center of the conflict was young, maybe in his early 20s, with an anxious stiffness to his posture. His hands trembled as he tried to defend himself, his words barely audible over the others. One of the men, a heavy-set guy with greasy hair and a permanent scowl, stepped forward, jabbing a finger at the young man's chest. "Don't play dumb, kid. You hit my car. You're not walking away from this," the man barked, his voice raw and mean. "I didn't hit anything," the young man stammered, his voice cracking. "I swear, it wasn't me." The second man, tall and wiry with a baseball cap pulled low over his brow, let out a cold laugh. "So what, you think we're blind? You think we don't know what we saw?" Tom slowed his steps, his gaze narrowing as he took in the scene. The young man's car, an old, beat-up sedan, sat wedged awkwardly between 2 newer models. There was a fresh scrape along the side of the heavy-set man's SUV. A shallow dent, nothing catastrophic, but enough to ignite tempers. The crowd that had gathered watched from a distance, murmuring among themselves, their curiosity outweighing their willingness to intervene. The third man, shorter and built like a bulldog, cracked his knuckles as he stepped closer, crowding the young man against his car. "You've got 2 options, pal," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You pay for the damage or we handle this the other way. Your choice." The young man swallowed hard, his back now pressed against the driver's side door. "I don't have money," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't even do anything." Tom stopped walking, his hands slipping out of his pockets as he took in the unfolding scene. Around him, onlookers stood frozen, torn between fascination and fear. No one moved. No one spoke up. The tension in the air was electric, crackling like a live wire waiting to snap. "Hey!" Tom's voice rang out, loud and clear, cutting through the commotion like a blade. The heavy-set man turned sharply, his scowl deepening as he squinted toward the source of the voice. Tom stepped forward, his face calm but unflinching, his movements deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't raise his hands, didn't puff himself up to appear larger. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the balance of the scene, drawing everyone's attention without him asking for it. "What's going on here?" Tom asked evenly, his gaze moving from one man to the next before settling on the young man still pinned against his car. "None of your business, buddy," the bulldog-like man snapped, his shoulders squaring as though challenging Tom to take another step. Tom ignored the insult. "It looks like someone's being cornered over something that doesn't seem very clear," the tall man with the baseball cap sneered, pointing toward the SUV. "It's pretty clear to us. This punk scraped the car, and he thinks he's getting away with it. Look at the dent." Tom glanced toward the SUV, tilting his head as though assessing it. "You sure about that?" he asked calmly, his voice mild but probing. The man blinked, momentarily thrown off. "What, you blind or something? It's right there." "I see the dent," Tom replied, nodding. "But I don't see how ganging up on this kid fixes anything." He shifted his attention back to the young man, who was staring at him with wide, almost disbelieving eyes. "Did you hit the car?" Tom asked him directly. The young man shook his head furiously. "No, sir. I swear I didn't touch it." Tom held his gaze for a beat, then looked back to the three men. "Hear that? He says he didn't do it." The heavy-set man let out a harsh laugh, his frustration bubbling over. "And you believe him? Who do you think you are, man? His lawyer?" Tom's smile was faint, but there was steel behind it. "No, just someone who doesn't like seeing people backed into a corner." The bulldog-like man stepped forward, his fists curling at his sides. "You got a problem with us? Is that what you're saying?" Tom tilted his head slightly, his calm unshaken. "I've got a problem with anyone who uses intimidation to get what they want. Especially when the situation's not as black and white as you're making it." The man in the baseball cap scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh great, we've got a hero here." The word hero hung in the air, laced with mockery, and the crowd murmured quietly in response. People were beginning to recognize Tom now. Whispers of his name rippled through the small group of onlookers like a wave. Phones appeared, faces turned, cameras pointed discreetly toward the scene. The tension escalated as the heavy-set man stepped closer, his face now inches from Tom's. "You think you're special, huh?" he hissed. "You think people like you can just walk in here and tell us what to do?" Tom didn't flinch. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to think about what you're doing." The bulldog man growled, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. "You think we're scared of you?" Tom's voice dropped slightly, his words slow and deliberate. "It's not about being scared of me. It's about doing the right thing." The crowd held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air had stopped moving. The young man, still pinned against his car, glanced nervously between Tom and the three men, his pulse visibly racing in his throat. The bulldog-like man's face darkened, his frustration boiling over, and for a split second, it looked like he might throw a punch. And then, a voice from the crowd cut through the stillness. "Hey, back off." Heads turned toward the speaker, an older man in a crisp uniform. A security guard, no doubt alerted by the growing crowd, stepped forward with an air of authority. His presence broke the spell, the three men's bravado visibly deflating as the guard's stern gaze landed on them. "What's going on here?" the guard barked. The heavy-set man hesitated, his jaw working as he tried to form an excuse. "This kid hit my car, and..." "Yeah," the guard interrupted sharply. "You've got insurance, don't you? Then take it up properly. No need for this nonsense." The three men fell silent, their energy fizzling under the weight of both the guard's authority and Tom's steady presence. The security guard crossed his arms, waiting, and after a beat, the heavy-set man muttered a curse under his breath before turning back to his SUV. "Let's go," he grumbled to the others. "It's not worth it." The bulldog-like man shot Tom a lingering glare, his eyes filled with silent challenge, but he didn't say another word. The three of them climbed back into their cars, the SUV's engine rumbling to life as they pulled away. The crowd began to disperse, the tension evaporating with the retreat of the men. Tom turned to the young man, who stood frozen beside his car, his face pale and disbelieving. "Are you okay?" Tom asked gently. The young man nodded quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe they left." Tom smiled faintly. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone to remind them they're not as big as they think." As the scene settled and the last of the chaos bled away, the world felt different, quieter. The sun now dipped below the horizon, splashing shades of orange and crimson across the city like a painter's final strokes on a masterpiece. Everything that had felt heavy just hours earlier now seemed light, as though the air itself had exhaled. The young man who had been cornered leaned against his car, still catching his breath, as if trying to process what had just happened. Tom Hanks stood beside him, not as a celebrity, not as a man basking in the admiration of a crowd, but as something much simpler, a human being who chose to do the right thing. And really, isn't that what this was all about? Because here's the truth. Most people freeze when it matters. Most people hesitate. They see someone in need, someone hurting, and they look around, waiting for someone else to step in. They convince themselves it's not their business, not their problem, and so they keep walking. But what Tom Hanks showed today wasn't heroism born from fame or fortune. It was heroism born from human decency, a reminder that doing the right thing doesn't require a script or applause. It requires action. But here's the thing about people who build their power on intimidation. It doesn't last. Think about that for a moment. They left with nothing. No money, no victory, and no respect. They slinked away like shadows disappearing into the night, their backs hunched, their bravado crumbling as they realized they weren't as big as they thought. And what did they lose? Not just their pride, but their place in a story that they'll never live down. Because make no mistake, when people remember today, they won't remember them as powerful or bold. They'll remember them as bullies who were exposed and who backed down. And if you think about it, isn't that always how these stories end? The bullies, the antagonists, they make noise, they flex their strength, and for a while it works. But when someone stands up to them, when someone refuses to flinch, they shrink. They scatter, because their power was never real in the first place. Now let's talk about the other side of this story. Because for every bully, there's someone like Tom Hanks. Someone who steps up when no one else will. Someone who doesn't care about the spotlight or the risks or whether they'll be praised or criticized. People like that don't do it for cameras. They don't do it for headlines. They do it because they can't look the other way. That's why Tom Hanks is so beloved, not just as an actor, but as a person. He doesn't wear a cape. He doesn't need superpowers. He's a guy in a blue shirt, stepping into the fray when it matters most. And the thing is, you can be that person too. We've all been there, on the sidelines, watching something happen that we know isn't right. Maybe you were too afraid to step in. Maybe you thought someone else would. Maybe you told yourself it wasn't your problem. And that's okay, we're human. But stories like this remind us that we can make a different choice next time. You don't have to be famous, or fearless, or strong. You just have to care. Because what did Tom Hanks really do today? He stopped. He spoke up. He stood his ground when no one else would. And those simple actions changed everything. A woman lying injured in the street was cared for. A young man who felt cornered and powerless was protected. And 3 men who thought they were untouchable were reminded that the world is watching. And what about you, the viewer? What's the takeaway here? Because stories like this, they're not just about Tom Hanks. They're about us. Every single one of us. They're about the moments where life hands you a choice. Do you keep walking? Or do you stop? Do you stay silent? Or do you speak up? Do you look the other way? Or do you face the problem head-on? These choices, however small, matter more than we realize. A single moment can ripple outward, changing the course of someone's day, maybe even their life. And let's be clear, you don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You just have to try. So the next time you see someone in need, whether it's a stranger on the street, a kid being bullied, or a person who just needs a little kindness, remember the story. Remember that you don't have to be someone like Tom Hanks to step up. You just have to be willing. And maybe, just maybe, one day you will be the reason someone's story has a happy ending. Because the antagonists, the bullies, they will always be there. But so will the people who stand up to them. People who remind us that decency still exists. People who refuse to let wrong win. And you can be one of them. If the story moved you, ask yourself, what would you have done in this situation? Would you have stepped up like Tom? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of courage is all it takes to turn a bad moment into a story worth sharing. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. We'll see you in the next one. Stay kind, stay brave, and take care.